Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE USA in Washington, D.C., and this is our Washington Update. This week, don't have quite as long of an update as usual. Congress was out of session for most of the time since our last update, but there's a bunch of things going on kind of in the background that we need to chat about. Mostly about the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which those of you who've joined us before know is the bill that creates the legal justification for the Defense Department. And we have some movement on that is worth noting. But we'll start where we usually start. Coming back, kind of our pre-COVID agenda for these calls. Quick look at the political calendar. The political conventions are coming up. The Democrats will be meeting in Milwaukee, August 17th through the 20th. Republicans will be, this is complicated. They're going to start in North Carolina for the first day of the convention, which is mostly kind of the business end of the convention. They got to, elect officers for the party. They got to approve the party platform, things that used to matter enormously back in the day and in modern times are not all that interesting or important, but still have to get done. Then the event will move to Jacksonville, Florida for the actual kind of political part of the process, the formal nomination of Donald Trump as the Republican nominee, and all the big name speeches. So it's a little more complicated. In both cases, though, the conventions are going to be unusual this year. The Democrats have intentionally moved their convention to a much smaller venue. And the purpose is obviously they don't want 10,000 people gathering for the convention because that could kill people. And so they moved to a smaller venue. They've left a lot of the kind of non-essential people out. And my understanding is that Senator Biden will be giving his acceptance speech, kind of the highlight of the convention, in a relatively small space with a relatively small crowd. A reasonable precaution. Republicans are doing something similar. One, they have their event in two locations, but also they've eliminated a lot of the alternative delegates and kind of non-essential participants. My understanding is that the President Trump speech will still be bigger, but it won't be as big as these things usually are. From our perspective, the significance of all this is simply that once we get to the conventions, we are in campaign season, and we more or less are now too. But Congress is going to stop working on substantive policy questions, focus on the couple things they have to do, like the budget, and really focus on getting themselves reelected. And so our focus shifts from kind of short term, what's going to get voted on this week, to more longer term, how do we set ourselves up to be successful in the future? Quick look at the economy, because this kind of drives the political debate here in Washington. The unemployment rate dropped in June again, oddly enough, to 11.1%. That's down from 14.7% just a couple months ago, which is a incredibly good improvement, although it's worth noting that 11.1% is still really, really bad. We are kind of out of depression levels of unemployment, but we're still in really bad recession levels. The number of jobs in the United States rose by 4.8 million in June. New hires increased 2.4 million in May. This data is a little bit behind, for a total of 6.4 million new jobs in May. So that's 2.4 more than we added in April. Both of those numbers, actually all three of those numbers, are historic highs. So we had historically awful numbers in March and April. We now have historically good numbers in May and June, all of which is very interesting to the economist in me. But the point of all this is simply that as the economy appears to continue to recover, for one thing, the pressure to do another big COVID relief bill begins to decline, which we expect in the next couple of weeks. But also Washington sort of reverts to its normal behaviors. Productivity fell in June by 0.9%, which is big, and in normal times would be troubling. But again, like we saw with some of the numbers last time, the decline in productivity seems to be linked to the creation of a large number of new jobs in kind of low productivity parts of the economy, like retail, like food services, which is actually a good sign. we don't want to improve the productivity numbers of our country by getting rid of, the bottom third of jobs, which would in fact improve productivity overall. But it would also cause lots and lots of people to lose their jobs, which is not good. So in this case, again, the productivity number appears to actually be a good sign, even though it's normally a bad one. Looking at COVID overall, graph of where the new cases are. These are new cases relative to the week before, and these are from last week, so they're a little bit dated. But you can see that the virus seems to be moving out of the Northeast, moving into the South and the West. It's worth noting that some of the states on this chart that are very hard hit, like Idaho and Montana, are starting from a really, really low base. And so since there weren't very many cases there before, the fact that there are 50% more cases this week doesn't actually mean that there was a huge number of new cases. But some of the states are interesting. Texas and Florida obviously are of concern. Louisiana got hit hard originally, and they seem to be recovering. So that's where we are. And if we look at the deaths, this is, I think, a useful chart. Again, this is about a month out of date, but the numbers were interesting, and the researcher that put it together hasn't duplicated his efforts. What he did is he looked at the number of deaths per number of people in each one of the states and then normalized them. So a normal state at the national average for deaths per person would be given a score of 1, which in this case is Indiana, by coincidence. And so if a state is above average, it gets a score of more than 1. If it's below average, it gets a score of less than 1. So looking at Ohio, the 0.59 doesn't actually mean anything, except that it's roughly half the national average. And this gives you an interesting way of comparing the states. You see some states, for example, I mentioned Idaho and Montana on the previous chart. You can see here, Montana was 5% of the national average for deaths. It's up a little bit now, but it's still going to be very, very low. But again, this gives you a nice look at where the pandemic has really hit, and the parts of the country that at least last month had been passed over. All right. Let's talk about the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. As I mentioned before, this bill creates the legal permission for the Defense Department to exist. And since we want a Defense Department and an Army and a Navy and Air Force and all that, you got to have this bill. And so this is the one piece of legislation that everybody thinks is going to pass this year. And thus, if you want anything passed, you have to get it attached to this bill. And we have some very good news on that front. The Senate released its list of amendments. Now, these have been proposed, not approved yet, but it's a list of amendments to the NDAA in the Senate. The House has already passed their bill. Little difference between the House and the Senate. The House generally requires amendments to bills to be germane. That is relevant to the topic of the bill in question. And so the House didn't vote on a lot of extraneous amendments. There were some that made it through, but most of their amendments to the NDAA actually had to do with the Defense Department. The Senate has much looser rules on germaneness, and so they allow a lot of amendments to bills that have nothing to do with the bills. And that's what we're doing now. A couple bills that are being added, or at least they're trying to add them to the NDAA as an amendment. The Industries of the Future Act, Senators Wickard, Baldwin, Gardner, and Peters, and I just point that out because we have 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, so that's a nice bipartisan bill, provides research and support for emerging and important technology industries in particular. Endless Frontier Act, that we mentioned last week. This is Senator Schumer's $100 billion program to boost technology research in the United States. Fantastic bill, and Senator Schumer made that bill his only amendment to the NDAA. Senator Schumer is the number 2 senator. He's the top Democrat in the Senate. And so he's an important guy. And for him to prioritize this act is a big deal. We also have the National AI Research Resource Act, which is very hard to say, from Senator Portman. This is a relatively limited AI bill, but one that we're kind of excited about. It is designed to help the government figure out how it's going to deal with AI systems, how it's going to think about them, how it's going to regulate them. The bill itself doesn't regulate AI, but it does set up a system for the federal government to figure out how it's going to regulate AI and starts putting some boundaries on what AI can and cannot do. IUUSA played a role in drafting the bill, providing advice to Senator Portman and Senator Cantwell from Washington, who has a similar bill that she's proposed as an amendment. And so we're excited that they're prioritizing these bills in the Senate. There is also a possibility, although it does not look at the moment like it's happened, that the CHIPS Act that we mentioned last week, that's a bill to encourage the repatriation of computer chip manufacturing into the United States. That bill does not appear to be amendment at the moment, but there's a chance it could be added later. We are also keeping our eyes open for visa and immigration bills to be attached to this bill. Like I said, since this is the only one that's going to pass, if you want to get legislation passed, you have to attach it to this. And so everybody's trying to attach everything, and anything's possible. Congress can set its own rules, and thus it can do anything it wants. We expect these amendments to be voted on in 2 weeks in the Senate. All right, so the big to-do this past Monday has to do with F visas for international students. The White House announced that it is going to put forward an emergency final rule to make some changes to the regulations governing international student visas, the F visa. It got a lot of attention. A lot of people got all upset about it. But I wanted to just go through exactly what the proposed rules would do and why, because there's not nearly as much here as some folks had suggested. The rules are coming from USCIS. They seek to amend existing regulations governing international student visas. The USCIS has proposed putting out emergency final rules because there isn't enough time between now and the fall semester for them to go through the formal rulemaking process. Here's what the deal is. Under existing regulations, and these are fairly long-standing regulations, international students may not take academic coursework entirely online. Under current rules, they may in fact only take one course per semester online or electronically. The logic there is that if you are taking an entirely online course of study, you don't need to be in the United States. The rules limiting international students to one online class a semester were written a very long time ago, a decade or so ago. And so some updating is probably useful. The rule change that was proposed on Monday actually expands the number of online courses international students can take. As long as they are taking one class in person, they can continue to use their student visas. The ban is only going to be on programs that are entirely online, which in normal times would be perfectly fine. Those programs tend to be a little bit sketchy, or at least they can. There are some excellent online programs, but there are also a lot of not so nice online programs. And so limiting this way is not unreasonable. The problem, of course, is this is not a normal time. A number of universities, including Harvard, are looking at going to be entirely online next year, or at least in the fall. And so under the rules, Harvard would not be allowed to accept any international students because those students wouldn't be allowed to use their visas. Now, they could take Harvard classes from wherever they're from. The problem is a lot of these students are already in the United States, and some of them cannot get home because of various quarantines, and many of them don't want to go home. And so it creates a real problem. Complicating this is that back in March, the administration announced that it would exempt all universities from these online coursework rules. So for the spring semester and the summer semester, universities have not had to comply with this, or more accurately, the international students haven't had to comply with this. And thus, many of them have been taking all of their courses online. All the administration did on Monday was say, we're not going to allow that anymore, but we will loosen the rules to allow international students to take more classes online, although they shouldn't take all of their courses online. Okay. IEEE is in the process of drafting a statement that will say we encourage the administration to extend the visa, the waiver rule until at least the end of 2020. And we thank the administration for loosening the rules because, you know, in the modern digital world, there's nothing wrong with international students taking more than one course online, though we understand the need for at least one of the courses to be in person. We are also calling on Congress to make the student visa dual intent. What that means, there's two basic, there's a couple different, but two general types of visas. There's visas, if you get a visa that allows you to enter the United States and you can't do anything else. So for example, tourists. Tourists come into the United States to go to Disneyland, that's all well and good, but they're not allowed to apply for any other type of visas while they're here. The tourist visa is single use. Dual use visas are visas you can get to come into the United States and then apply for another visa. The H-1B is a good example of that, and many people take advantage of that to use the H-1B to stay in the country to work while they try to get a green card. Student visas are single use. If you're an international student, you cannot even dream about eventually becoming an American. You certainly can't take any steps to make it happen. By making the student dual intent, it will allow international students to begin the immigration process while they are still a student, which will make the process, you know, if you got 4 years of study and it takes 5 years to get a visa, well, then you only actually have to wait 1 year because you can start it as soon as you get here. So it makes the process more easier and helps protect international students from disruptions like COVID because students do get certain residency rights while they are in the process of applying for a green card. And again, we are reiterating our request to Congress that they create at least 50,000 new EB green cards. That is a sufficient number to let all international graduate students in the United States in STEM fields move from a student visa to a green card within a year of graduating. Under current rules, dual intent, they should be able to move seamlessly as soon as they get their diploma. So this international student rule change it complicates things, but it doesn't complicate them as much as some groups are suggesting, which is one of the reasons IEEE USA isn't yelling very loud about it, because I think it is a little less of a change than some people thought. Quick update on infrastructure. The House passed H.R. 2, which is a quick and dirty infrastructure bill, a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill. There are some things in that bill that we like. There is some money for broadband deployment, although not specific to rural America. Dig Once is in there, which is exciting, which is a smaller issue that IEEE USA supports and has mentioned a few times on the Hill. The deal there is that broadband and other cables run under streets typically. And the way it's done now is each company rips up the street, lays down their cable, and builds the street back on top of it, which is great until the next company wants to come along and build and put down fiber, in which case they have to dig up the road again. The proposal with Dig Once would be to build not wires or cables underneath the roads, but to build conduits underneath the roads through which cables could be run. That would allow IT companies to run new wire under the roads without actually ripping the roads up. The proposal in the House bill would allow federal highway funds to be spent to build those conduits, which is an important step, which is good. A little bit of language in the bill about developing regulations for self-driving cars, not a lot, but there's some in there. The problem with this bill is that there's a lot more in there. Well, there's two things. First of all, there's a lot more in this bill than I'm mentioning, things that don't affect IEEE USA necessarily, but which are very partisan and political, which is all, not to say they're wrong or bad, but the White House has already said they're going to veto the bill if it passes. There's no real indication the Senate plans to take this up. So it's unlikely this bill is going to go anywhere. The other thing to note about H.R. 2 is that there's far less infrastructure money for electronic infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, and the other unique things that IEEE USA cares about than we would have hoped. There's some in there, but not nearly as much as we were looking for. So this bill is interesting. It will get talked about a bit. It's unlikely to go anywhere, but it is an opening bid in what we hope eventually becomes a real debate over infrastructure spending. Some good news. IEEE fellow, Dr. Panchanathan, it turns out I've been pronouncing his name slightly wrong for the last couple of weeks, which I apologize for. But Dr. Panchanathan has been sworn in as the new NSF director, which is very exciting. So we look forward to working with him. Our next update is July 24th, 2 weeks from now, 1:00 p.m. as always. And I am Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE USA in Washington, D.C., where I am now. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My phone number is 202-530-8326. Please reach out with any questions, concerns over the next couple weeks. And if you want to help IEEE USA with our efforts on Capitol Hill, we're always looking for good volunteers. And with that, let me flip screens. There we go. Okay. Why is NDAA must pass? Many programs have not been reauthorized for several years that they continue to function. Dr. Brendan Godfrey, our former Vice President of Government Relations and now our Vice President for Communications. Dr. Godfrey, you are, of course, correct. Congress, they make the rules, so they can fiddle with them if they'd like to do so. The problem is a government aid, a program has to be reauthorized periodically. It's in the laws when these programs are created, and it forces Congress to take a look at the programs to make sure they're working correctly and to make changes if necessary. So forcing the programs to be reauthorized periodically is a good system. And for a lot of programs, they reach the point where they have to be reauthorized, and then they're not. And what happens is Congress sticks language in some bill that says, NASA can continue to function, which is all well and good. The problem is when programs are not formally reauthorized, it makes it very difficult for the programs to plan long term. And it makes operating a little trickier. Which is fine for smaller programs and kind of basic government programs, but this is the Defense Department. The Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and now Space Force needs a solid legal foundation upon which to function, because the Army has to think long term. I mean, the Army controls billions of dollars, and in fact, I would imagine billions of acres of land. They have to make long-term plans in terms of personnel, deployments, research. And so while it is technically correct that NDAA doesn't really need to be reauthorized immediately, I mean, they have to do something, but they could fudge it. The practical implications of that are fairly severe. And it's one thing to have, the Department of Health and Human Services have some additional hoops to run through if it wants to function correctly. But it is a much different thing if the Defense Department has to do that, because, of course, the Defense Department, well, they're fighting wars. They have to respond fairly quickly. Jonathan, do we have any other questions? Okay. For those of you who have posted questions online, I will try to circle back to them this afternoon and respond to them. If you think of anything in the next day or two, feel free to reach out. Again, email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My phone number is 202-530-8326. Hope everyone has a good month, stays safe, and I look forward to talking with you again in 2 weeks. Thank you.